The Cold War changed everything for most organisations on the left, and the Connolly Association was no exception. Sales of the Irish Democrat declined and the association was having financial difficulties. There were some in the leadership who felt that the Irish Democrat was no longer viable. Greaves profoundly disagreed with this view and took on the responsibility of editing the newspaper. And in time he gave up his job and began to work full-time for the Connolly Association.
And of course Britain developed its own atom bomb at that time, and the conflict, the Cold War conflict with Russia and the fear of communism on the continent that began to dominate world politics. And in that context, of course, the Labour government proved of great disappointment to Ireland and to Irish public opinion, and including to Irish people in Britain, because in 1949 the Labour government passed the Ireland Act saying there would be no change to the constitution of Northern Ireland without the consent of the Stormont Parliament, not the people but the Stormont Parliament, which seemed to underwrite the Unionist administration in the north of Ireland by Labour. And that was considered a great betrayal of the Irish cause by the Irish community in Britain, and by many of them. There were, of course, there were Labour opponents of this, Geoffrey Byng and Hugh DeLagh and others. There were Labour MPs who opposed it, and the Connolly Association supported them and lobbied them, and they spoke on one of those platforms and so on. But there was a huge disillusionment with the Labour government. At the same time, the Anti-Partition League was founded in Ireland by the main political parties here to advocate opposition to partition, and De Valera was now out of office after from 48 on, having been replaced by a coalition government led by Desmond Greaves. And De Valera threw himself into the Anti-Partition League meetings around Britain, indeed, and he spoke in platforms. And the Anti-Partition League became quite a big organisation among the Irish community in Britain for a couple of years. And I know Desmond Greaves often said the conversation was too aloof from the Anti-Partition League, and it did not really throw itself behind the League. At the same time, one theme in the Anti-Partition League propaganda was that if only Britain would move on the Irish question in relation to partition, well then Ireland would join NATO. And that we couldn't join NATO until Britain moved on partition. And that was a big theme in Anti-Partition League outlook. And of course the conversation was, and the Connolly Clubs, or Connolly Association as it then was quite opposed to NATO on principle because of its own left-wing orientation and affiliations. And so those were issues of the late 40s. Then there were other developments. The general trend towards the right at the time led to a big decline in the left-wing bookshops, which had been key sales outlets for the Irish Democrat all over Britain, in the different towns and so on. And the Irish newspapers were not going back for sale in the Irish community, and for those reasons the Irish Democrat sales began to decline quite radically, and there was talk at the very end of the 40s of closing the paper down, or that it couldn't be kept going any longer. There were a number of changes of editors. Frank Campbell was the last editor, and it was about to close when Desmond Greaves volunteered to take over the editorship, and that was 48, and he remained non-full-time editor for a few years. Then from 51 onward he became a full-time editor.
The Connolly Association had to reinvent itself. Being just an appendage of the British left was not enough. New policies and a different strategy were adopted. What was this new departure?
Well, as Desmond Greaves put it in his own pamphlet, Reminiscences of the Connolly Association, there were always two trends. There were those who saw the association as a kind of transmission belt for Irish people into British left-wing organisations, particularly the Communist Party. And there were those who said that what we needed in Britain was an independent Irish organisation which would champion the interests of the Irish community and of Irish people in Britain, and at the same time seek to influence British politics on Ireland in favour of the Irish cause, Irish national reunification, and British withdrawal from Ireland. There were these two trends of policy, if you like, of values, which had contended for a long time, which were held by different people. And it was very much under Greaves's influence and that of his colleagues that the latter trend, the anti-imperialist trend, won out and was embodied in a new orientation for the Connolly Association, which was embodied in changing its constitution.
Blending the old with the new required some of the old experienced personnel along with the new members. Who were these new people?
Well, the 1950s saw the advent of a number of new Irish people to the association who were quite influential. The late Joe Deegan, who came from Belfast, had been active in Irish language circles and Republican circles. He became a key man in the Manchester Connolly Association, and for many years was a very close colleague of Greaves in the early 50s and the early middle 50s. Pat Bond, who came from Dublin, Logford, Dublin, and Elsie O'Dowling, Con McLean, Justin Keating was in England as a student for a period before he came back to Ireland. And there were younger people, a younger generation, and they were, while they were on the left, they also were strongly nationalist inclined. Jack Bennett, I shouldn't forget, of course, leading member of the association for a while, and a close colleague of Desmond Greaves's, who came from Belfast, a Protestant background, and strongly supported the nationalist line, which Greaves was very much pushed as a full-time person editing the Irish Democrat.
What impact did the new editor have on the Irish Democrat?
Well, of course, he was full-time. He was highly intelligent and a brilliant man, and he knew something about newspapers. And of course, the policy that the conversation was now advocating a more nationalist line, if you like, on Ireland, was more popular, and the sales began to increase and improve. And Jack Bennett was particularly helpful in that respect, who had a considerable journalistic experience. He later, of course, worked in the Belfast Telegraph on the north, and later on the Irish Press on the south. And so there was new blood and new ideas and good cohesive group with Greaves and Deegan and others who saw a new role for the association from the middle 1950s onward.
The transition was complete with the new constitution in 1955 and a different approach to the six counties. Can you elaborate on the new constitution and the change in strategy in terms of the north?
Well, the new constitution of the association adopted in 1955 made clear that the organisation was not a socialist organisation as such. It was an organisation of Irish people in Britain who sought to defend their interests within the labour movement through encouraging members to join trade unions and so on. And that it would seek to organise and mobilise public opinion in Britain, particularly the Irish community, but also supportive English or British opinion in support of an anti-imperialist line in Ireland and in support of democracy in the six counties, as long as the six counties were part of the United Kingdom. And also it sought to make known the teachings of the Republican teachings in support of national independence of the socialist James Connolly. And there was the clear implication that if you were a socialist, you should be a strong supporter of national independence for Ireland and everywhere else. So that issue was, so to speak, cleared up in the new constitution, which had for a long time bedevilled the attitudes of people on what was the appropriate policy for Irish people in Britain. Should they be socialists or should they be anti-imperialists? And so the association, the new constitution, made that quite clear. And specifically then, of course, in the subsequent years, Greaves and his colleagues in the association began to concentrate on what became civil rights issues in the six counties. That was the weakness, that was the soft underbelly, the Achilles heel, or whatever metaphor one uses for the unionist establishment in the six counties, the lack of civil rights there, the discrimination against Catholics, while this area was part of the United Kingdom. And the association concentrated on exposing that and trying to organise British public opinion, specifically British Labour or Liberal opinion against that, from the 1955-56 onward, culminating, of course, in the whole idea of a civil rights movement, which really emanated from Greaves and the Connolly Association. I think it's generally recognised.
Another aspect of the new constitution was that the Connolly Association would not affiliate or accept affiliation from any political party. What was the thinking behind this?
Well, it was to stress the independence of the association that was open to people of any or no party. I suppose the bulk of its members always were, and in my time anyway, when I was there in the late 50s, early 60s, the bulk of the members were not in any party. And then some would have been in the Labour Party, some in the Communist Party. while of course there had always been left-wing connections, one must remember this association was never a proscribed organisation by the British Labour Party or anything like that, even though some people said it had communists in it, which it had of course. Desmond Greaves was himself from the CP. But this made quite clear this was an independent organisation. And I think if you look through the Irish Democrat and what was written in it, certainly from the middle 50s onward, you can see a completely independent line. And that even though Desmond Greaves was himself a member of the CP all his life, he was often bitterly critical, at least in private, of CP policy on Ireland, on the failure of at least some CP people to adopt a strong policy and an anti-imperialist policy in Ireland. Because of course there were all of these two traditions. On the other hand, the only party in Britain, the political party in Britain, which was against partition, had been for decades, was of course the British CP, you must remember, whereas the Labour Party, at least as shown by the Labour government, backed the installment regime throughout, with of course always some opposition from within its own ranks. So the association was an independent organisation, still is, and its policy is made by its annual conference, and it's like any other anti-imperialist lobby group, like the anti-apartheid movement or movement colonial freedom or bodies like that.
When members returned to Ireland, they were free to join any political organisation. The Connolly Association gave no advice on this matter. Could you explain the thinking behind this approach?
The logic was that people living in one state should not interfere in what goes on in another state, because if you're in one state you have to carry the can, so to speak, for whatever one does, and politics in Britain are different from politics in Ireland. And I know Desmond Greaves was always very strong on that point, and that people in Ireland shouldn't interfere in British politics or vice versa. They could work in parallel or support one another by working in parallel, but the political contexts were quite different. And so therefore it would be quite inappropriate for returning immigrants from Britain to Ireland to be urged to do this, that. I mean, obviously people would wish that they would follow progressive courses and be active politically, but it was up to them to decide how. And there was absolutely while over the years, quite a number of people who were active in the Association of Britain, Justin Keating, for example, Colin MacLear, myself, Redmonds, Sean and Tom Redmond, many others returned to Ireland. They were never given any particular guidance or instructions, not to mind instructions as to what to do. They entirely left to themselves to decide what they wanted to do.
And there were some who disagreed with this approach.
Well, there was always this tension between those people on the left who thought that national independence and national democracy was not the primary issue in a country that had a national problem, and those who advocated socialism, the economic and social changes that they might regard as socialism, a leftist and you might call a non-leftist line. And that existed in British left-wing organisations. It existed in the Labour Party, it existed in the Communist Party, it existed among citizens generally, it existed in the ranks of the Connolly Association. But the new policy adopted and expressed in the 1955 Constitution made clear what the policy of the association was. It was not to advocate socialism in Ireland, it was not to try and get Irish people in Britain into British socialist or left-wing organisations. It was to defend their interests as workers in Britain, and the prime way of doing that was to join trade unions, and was to try and influence British government policy on Ireland. This was not a question of socialism, it was a question of anti-imperialism, as long as Britain was involved in Ireland.
After emigrating to England in the 1950s, you joined the Connolly Association.
Well, I've been in touch with some friends of mine in Cork, Keller Hurley particularly, who was quite active in the association, and when I went to England, under his influence or with him, I went along to the West London branch. I did so in fact on my first night in London in October '58, and soon got involved in the work of the association. I was very impressed by it, and within a year I was secretary of the West London branch.
And in time you became a full-time official.
Yes, they raised a fund to set up to get a national organiser in 1960-61, and I was made national organiser. I was already on the executive of the association, of course. So Desmond Greaves was full-time editor of the Democrat, and I was national organiser of the association in 1960-61.
Could you elaborate on the day-to-day activity of the Connolly Association?
But of course the association had a monthly newspaper, the Democrat, the Irish Democrat, and I remember around 1960 it had an annual or a monthly sale of some 10,000 copies, which were almost all sold around the pubs on a face-to-face basis between the sellers and those who bought it. That represented a very high level of activity, paper selling. But of course the actual political work of the association was then oriented towards lobbying in British Labour and trade union circles to try and raise the issues of discrimination in the 6 counties in Northern Ireland. And there were a number of regular lobbies of the House of Commons, raising issues of discrimination in the North in trade union branches. The association, of course, encouraged Irish people, and many of its own members were trade union activists, and encouraged Irish people to join trade unions and to raise within their trade unions various civil rights issues relating to that part of the United Kingdom known then as Northern Ireland. So those were one of the main practical activities of the association.
And there was the Mullen and Talbot trial.
Well, the association was trying to show British public opinion, and particularly British Labour opinion, that there were terrible abuses in the 6 counties. And that was the reason why they sent observers, John Hostetler, the lawyer, to observe the notorious Mullen and Talbot trial in 1958, where these young men had suffered grave abuses at the hands of the RUC, and this was raised in the context of their trial. And that was I went to England and joined the association just after that had occurred. And then the next 3 years, I should say, was dominated by the Release the Prisoners campaign, because there were several hundred, 200 to 300 young people kept in Crumlin Road prison, Belfast, in the aftermath of the IRA's 1956-61 campaign, and these prisoners were there interned without charge or trial in a part of the United Kingdom. And most people in Britain, of course, didn't know this. And the association said, I went around trade union branches and raised with various Labour MPs and so on. Do you know that in the United Kingdom there are hundreds of people imprisoned without charge or trial, and yet the issue can't be raised in Westminster, because the prevailing convention in Westminster at the time was that any matter devolved to the Northern Ireland government, to Brooper and Company, could not be raised at Westminster, because justice had been devolved under the Government of Ireland Act to the Stormont Parliament and government, and therefore anything to do with justice or the allocation of housing or things like that could not be raised in Westminster. And it was Desmond Greaves then looked at the Government of Ireland Act and on the basis of legal advice which he got from D.N. Pritt, well-known QC, drew attention to the point that the supreme authority of the United Kingdom Parliament prevailed over the 6 counties, and Parliament could do what it liked in relation to the 6 counties, and that therefore this convention was an absurdity, and this was the basis for a long campaign of lobbying in the subsequent years then of Parliament, the Parliament at Westminster, to break this convention, which was of course a very convenient convention to let sleeping dogs lie and the abuses in the 6 counties to go on unreformed. But the Release the Prisoners campaign from 58 to 61 led to a situation where over half the Parliamentary Labour Party was induced to sign successive telegrams to Brooper calling for the release of these prisoners, and the association hit upon the point that some of them were members of British trade unions, which had been organising in the North of Ireland, and this was very useful in trying to bring home to their counterparts in Britain that some of their members in the North of Ireland were interned without charge or trial for years on end, and this was an eye-opener for many people in British Labour and trade union circles in those years.